Rendering of Abraham Lincoln. As you can see, it's a big space. We're looking at the plumbing HVAC side all the way through to automotive at the very back. HDM did some fantastic drawings for our donors. We're trying to find donors to help with this project. So we'll show another one of TJ here in a minute. But as you can see from this, you can actually have great sight lines all the way through the classroom from one side to the other. So that allows the two staff members that are going to be working in this space to see all areas at all times. We're also looking at leaving some plumbing, HVAC, and electrical exposed in a safe manner so we can use the building as a learning. This is a smaller project. The plan, we are actually going to be removing the walls between the current office, storage, and paint booth area. This is going to be our new fire exit in the future because we're going to be opening up these two spaces. And then also during the summer, we're looking at building 6 virtual welding booths, as well as a new office for 2 staff members up in this corner. We're estimating that the cost of this project will be in about the $145,000 range. This is a great sketch of what our virtual welders are going to look like. This is what our students will use during the school year. They actually will come up to this booth. It mimics a real welding booth. They have a flat screen panel in the back. They have the virtual welder on the countertop, and then they have the computer portion of it underneath the counter. They can sit or stand at these stations. You're seeing this in the TJ colors, but we'll actually do AL or TJ depending upon which site they're at. Here's another rendering of Thomas Jefferson. Again, we're working on sight lines throughout the space. Luckily for TJ, they have a very big space. They have 2 big classrooms. And at TJ, the TJ space currently has robotics in it, so we're going to continue to house robotics in with the CTE group over there. Again, we'll have some exposed space so we can use the building as a learning tool. At this building, kind of similar to AL, we're going to be removing the office space, which is here in the middle. We're going to be moving the office back into a storage area that is back behind with good windows around the perimeter. We're opening up the wall in this area. We have the 6 new virtual welding spots here. The robotics that we were talking about actually are in these 2 rooms. We're updating this classroom with a few new seats. We have some broken seats that need to be updated over there. And then we're going to be cleaning out the storage room up here to add more storage for the space in the future. Our estimated cost on this project is about $245,000. Moving on to our schedule, tonight we're bringing the public hearing as well as the award of contract later this evening. If all goes well, we're looking at starting construction tomorrow. We have a contractor who's biting at the bit and wants to get going. We have a very short time frame because we're trying to get this done by August 10th and punch list completed by August 17th. School is starting, is it August 23rd, if I remember correctly? So we have to get a lot of work done in a really short amount of time. And we want to give thanks to HDM because they have really worked really hard to get plans and specs and everything out to the contractor in a short time frame. All in all, between the 2 projects, the total demolition package value is about $390,000. Phase 2, a little bit bigger project, got the ta-da in it. It's about $1,110,000. It's about a $1.5 million project altogether at both sites. We currently have a $500,000 anonymous donor that was wanting us to get going on this right away, so we had to come up with some stuff that we could do this summer. And our Continuing Ed Foundation is working on some additional funding, hopefully moving forward. This evening, we're hoping to award the contract. Just kind of a quick recap, we sent the project out to bid on June 7th, received bids on June 21st. We only received one bid, and we were kind of scared when we were opening it, but it came in at $320,170, which is about $70,000 under our estimated value, which is like, ta-da. With that being said, we'd like to recommend to the board to approve the contract to Anderson Construction this evening in the amount of $320,170. So with that being said, is there any questions?
Any questions from the board members?
Just curious, why is TJAAL's demolition?
There was a lot more mechanical and electrical items that need to be removed and replaced. Once we got into some of that demo work, that's pretty much where a lot of that cost is coming in.
So that wasn't done when TJ was remodeled 10 years ago?
Since we're taking out some of those walls, we have to move some of there's existing lines that have to be moved and basically replaced once all that office space comes out. That's just something that they wouldn't have been able to do anyways during that
But the
remodel
build
phase.
out at AL will be quite a bit pricier overall
Yes.
because they don't have the. Like
Don't have the space
Don't have the
that
space.
TJ does. Yeah, I gathered that
An
from.
interesting,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions from the board? And so then, just curious then, so the demolition begins. What does the space look like? What's the usefulness of the space until completion?
Yeah, next spring.
Just curious.
And I'm gonna have to, so what you'll see is we'll still have, at AL, we'll still have the existing construction science room
Okay.
that's currently there today. This area was actually office storage and a paint booth. So it's
Okay.
gonna mimic the same room that they currently have today. We're just opening it up, getting it ready. This fall, we're hoping to start this project where we'll start opening this up, which is also a great learning tool for the folks over there.
As they're doing the building, yeah.
It's kind of similar at TJ, and you still have the same two spaces that they currently have. We're just taking this area out in the middle, so we're just opening them up.
Okay.
So really, they're having the same space, we're just kind of cleaning it up, getting it ready for construction in its space.
Okay.
And adding the welding.
And adding all the welding booths, there's 6 at each side. Right now, they're just sitting on a countertop, so we're gonna make them cool. Make them a little bit more like real welding.
Okay. All right. If there's no other questions from the board, thank you.
All right, thank you.
If there's anyone in the audience who would like to address their board regarding the demolition package, please step up to the mic and say your name and address. And seeing no one, we will close the public hearing for this portion and take this up during the regular meeting later. I will call to order the regular meeting of the Council of Community Schools for June 26, 2018. Mr. Wilson, please call the roll.
Mr. Grove.
Here.
Mr. LaFurla. Present. Mr. Kazire. Present. Mr. McGlade.
Present.
And Mr. Arthur.
Present. Please join me for a moment of silence, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. Now I need approval of our agenda. Is there a motion?
Move approval of the agenda.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on this agenda?
Don't we need to amend this a little bit?
You bet.
I would move to amend the agenda to delete the annual technology report and the annual library media report. We'll deal with those at the July meeting because the presenters aren't in town.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on that amendment?
An explanation, would they like
We know.
that? Okay, good.
Mr. Wilson, actually, can we do this just a voice?
Yeah.
Yeah, so all in favor of the
Amendment.
amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign, and the amendment is carried. And now we need a motion on the,
No,
or now we need a approval of our agenda
as amended.
as amended. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign, and the amended agenda is approved. Would I have to click
Good.
that?
Very good.
Now I need approval of minutes from the work session and regular business meeting of May 22nd and the work session of June 7th, 2018. Is there a motion?
I'll move approval of the minutes from the work session and regular business meeting of May 22nd and the work session of June 7th.
Thank you. Chris, is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, sir. Any corrections, changes to this, amendments? All right. All in favor of the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign, and the minutes are carried. Now we have the public participation portion of the meeting. If anyone in the audience would like to speak to the board, you may step up to the microphone. You'd have 3 minutes to talk, and just state your name and address for the record. And seeing no one wanting to do that, we will move on to the superintendent's report. Dr. Murillo.
Thank you, Mr. Arthur. At this time, I'd like to ask Ms. Ostrowski to join me at the podium. We are going to celebrate our Volunteer of the Year, and at this time, Ms. Ostrowski, I'll allow you to begin, and I'll circle around.
Okay, wonderful. Good evening.
Good evening.
Very excited this evening to be able to celebrate a community member who's given his time and talent to our students and to our colleagues here at the district to make us even better at what we're doing for kids. So, Anthony Kava, he's a digital forensics technology administrator with the Potawatomi County Sheriff's Office and our school district's Volunteer of the Year. Mr. Kava has generously shared his talents and time with the Council Bluffs Schools since 2010. He's an annual presenter at the 8th grade career fair and at Career Rocket Days. He is a technology department advisor for the Cybersecurity Committee and has assisted the Cybersecurity Club for students at Wilson Middle School. Mr. Kava has also connected students with internship opportunities as part of the Potawatomi County Telephone Project. Can you imagine going and working in the courthouse or the Potawatomi County building with the telephones? Finally, and most impressively, he is an expert coach for the Kern and Abraham Lincoln High School Cyber Patriots teams. His nominators shared the following. As a Cyber Patriot team coach at Kern Middle School, Tony rearranged his work schedule so that he could make weekly visits and meet with students and share his expertise. These visits required lots of his time preparing work about hacking culture, hacking mindset, how to harden hosts, and information on working with Windows, Linux, and other valuable resources. And I had to look up how to say Linux. Did I say it right? Awesome. Not only did he make a weekly commitment to us and our students, he was also there monthly from 4 to 9 p.m. for the competitions, all while having a family of his own who's here tonight with him. Besides being a Cyber Patriot mentor, the students viewed him as someone who shared the same passion. They came to him for advice on parts and pieces for computers as they were building their own computers at home. He also inspired them to dream big and reach for their goals. As a Cyber Patriot team coach at Abraham Lincoln for the past 2 years, Anthony Kava has volunteered to be the resident technical mentor for the AL Cyber Links Cyber Patriots team. He has made a solid commitment to be here for the Cyber Links students. He took his personal vacation time to be there at least once a week to mentor the students on how to, again, harden their operating systems and networks in preparation for their different competitions. Working with the students, Tony demonstrates an amazing passion for technology and for the students. At the Cyber Patriots competitions, Tony displays as much excitement and enthusiasm for the competition as the students. Throughout the 6-hour competitions, he's encouraging and supportive as a mentor who provides a calming influence on the students to do their best and not to be distracted by other factors throughout that long competition. I have a few comments that the teachers shared with us from students. I'd like to share those. From Liam, he's very kind and loves to crack jokes. He also created a custom scoreboard software just for our Cyber Patriots team, so it's easier to see what we're scoring throughout the competition all night. Caleb said, he's very helpful from helping me learn every step of the way to understanding more than I would have ever known. He's been one of the core reasons I did so well in the Cyber Patriots competition. John said he took vacation time to assist us and even gave us some old computers to play with. His knowledge of security and Ubuntu, I didn't look that up, Linux, helped our team's loads when we got into harder competitions, and he's super fun to converse with. As an inside joke, hopefully I'm not giving it away, they call him Carver. Did you know that? Okay. Jake said, Tony helps us understand exactly what we're doing and is very good at explaining everything, and it helps us that he's very genuinely interested in all of this. Not only that, but he committed his time to a bunch of kids he didn't even know just because we asked him to do so. He is a true mentor, leader, and role model. We would not be anywhere close to where we are today if not for Tony, Jake said. For all of these reasons, and with our sincere appreciation as a school district, congratulations to Mr. Anthony Kava, the 2018 Council Bluffs Community School District Volunteer of the Year. And for his honor, as they get ready to take some pictures, the Community Education Foundation partners with us in recognizing our volunteer with a plaque that we hope you will display proudly, and with a check for $150 for his efforts and his dedication to our school district. Thank you. Come on, Carver.
We'll put you one on each side, have him in the middle.
Are you one of his students? Would you want to join us? Would that be all right? Yeah. Would you mind being in a picture with us? Okay. I love it. I love it.
Everybody look at me and smile. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And one more. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, and thank you to Ms. Deborah Robinson for being here, to our Cyber Patriots advisor and computer expert at Abraham Lincoln High School. So, thank you.
Okay. Now we move on to the student achievement portion. Says Iowa assessment results.
Yes, at this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Forthman to the podium to present on our annual Iowa assessment results as we take a look at the growth that has occurred over this past year.
All right, good evening.
Good evening.
It's my pleasure to bring to you tonight an update on our Iowa assessment results for the 2017-18 school year. And joining me tonight is Dr. Marty Shudak, Director of Data Management and Assessment. He will be answering all the hard questions, and I'll take the softballs. So I want to frame our conversation tonight a little bit before we get started around this idea of growth. And the reason for doing that is you've heard my song and dance about the Iowa assessments for several years now. So I didn't want to bore you with slides about the fact that the Iowa assessment's not aligned to the Iowa core curriculum and that there's good data to show that it's not. I didn't want to bore you with slides that showed you that it tests off-grade level material in almost every grade and that less than 20% of it actually is aligned to the curriculum. I'm not going to talk about that. But what I do want to talk about is the fact that we can get some use out of this data. And specifically, we have an opportunity here at the end of year 7 of Iowa assessments to look back and see how have we done. Have students grown? Has our district grown in terms of academic achievement over the last 7 years that we've had these Iowa assessments, Form E and F? As Iowa assessments are sunsetted as we know them. So beginning in the 2018-19 school year, Iowa will adopt a new state assessment known as the Next Generation Iowa Assessment. We don't know what that looks like. In fact, really, we know very little about that assessment, except that it will not be Form E or F. We know that it will be an assessment that is produced by Iowa Testing Programs in Iowa City. We know that it will have selected response and constructed response items for the first time in Iowa, as well as some possible performance events, which we're interested to see what that looks like. We also know that it will likely be much more expensive than the current assessment that we have, and that it will not be funded completely by the Department of Education. We will have to bear some additional budget for the Iowa assessments in this next coming school year. So this is our opportunity to look back. I wish I could say with fondness, but that would be a lie, at the Iowa assessments, and try to reflect on what they can tell us over time. So I want to look at them in several different ways. First of all, the guiding question for tonight is really, what can the Iowa assessments tell us about academic growth? What can they tell us about the last 7 years of assessment history with a consistent measurement? And so we're going to spend less time tonight talking about proficiency and more time talking about our kids making improvements. Are they showing some growth over time? So I want to first look tonight at reading and math. And this is the charts that I've shown you for years and years. It shows you what percentage of students are hitting that proficiency threshold. And for example, in reading, this is showing all grade levels from grades 2 through 11 and how they're doing by cohort over the last 7 years. So similar groups of students as they march through the school system. And you can see inconsistent across the board. Some years we have trends that are going up. Some years we have trends that are kind of all over the place. Some years we have some spikes. Some years we have valleys. Same is true when we look at math. We have some great, for the most part, some good growth in most of our cohort areas and most grade levels. There are outliers, which we know. Those spikes are, we can point to the assessment that is, because we know it's the assessment that is the most unaligned of all of them. And we know that. We've talked about that in previous years. So what we want to really spend some time tonight talking about is growth. So do kids make progress on the Iowa assessments? So the first chart I want to spend some time tonight reviewing with you is cohort growth. So how many points do kids grow, and are they growing like all the rest of the kids in the state of Iowa? So this is a chart that was produced by Iowa Testing, and what you see is the dotted line is what we would expect to be typical growth. That's where about the average student, how much they would grow every year and what their trajectory would be from grades 3 all the way through 11. Our lines are the ones, the dashed lines above them, and they show where they are green, where we had positive growth, meaning our students grew by the number of points that are indicated on the chart each year. Green shows that it was positive growth, yellow was modest growth, and red was negative growth. And you can see in reading, looks pretty darn good. Our kids grow every single year on Iowa assessments as a whole, with the exception of 11th grade reading, which has about a 10% dip across the state. If you look at pretty much any school district in the state of Iowa, you're going to see a dip from 10th grade reading to 11th grade reading. And we've talked about that in the past as to my hypothesis around why that is in the, regarding that specific testing item. Yeah, please. About the same kids, correct. So the kids who are in 6th grade this year, they're in 7th grade the next year, they go, correct, yep.
I can reasonably look at like the reading percent proficient table and just kind of go 17, 18, 11, 16, 17, 10th.
Correct.
And just kind of get that same
Yep.
general, yeah.
Yeah, the difference here is what it's showing is when you see on the left side, they convert the percent proficient into national scale scores, which is a fancy way for saying we have a continuous scale from 3rd grade all the way through 11th grade. And so if students score better each year, what we would anticipate would happen is their scale score would get higher and higher and higher. And it's a way for us to basically compare one year to the next, to the next, to the next. So the same can be said about math. As you can see, our growth from cohort from year to year to year ranges anywhere from 15 in 3rd to 4th grade all the way up to 8 points from 10th to 11th grade. And the nice thing about both of these charts, the exception of 10th or 11th grade English, is we continue to widen the gap between the average and how our students are doing. If you look at the distance between the average line and our line, it gets bigger for the most part from year to year. And the same can be said with reading. It starts very narrow here and gets wider as it goes up. So what that shows is that our kids are actually accelerating. They're making more than expected growth for the most part. So we weren't satisfied with just looking at and saying, yeah, our kids are growing. We wanted to know how much have they grown over the last 7 years, or have they grown? We've spent lots of time talking about percent proficient, and we went up 2 points this year and down 4 last year, and up 2 in this grade, but down 3 in this grade. So Dr. Shudak put his statistical testing to the test and looked at how could we actually figure out in the last 7 years, did we get better? Did we get worse, or did we stay the same? So I'm gonna let Dr. Shudak talk about the slopes of some lines.
Thanks, Dr. Borthman. Yeah, so as Dr. Borthman mentioned, first thing we ask when the test scores come back is how do they look. They've gone up compared to last year in one area, or one grade down in another, and so we see that up and downness when we compare just to the previous year. Sometimes they'll go up compared to the previous year because the previous year they went down compared to the previous year over that. So we've been learning more about this idea of meta-analysis, been reading more about that in the research and learning, the concept of it. And we have a long way to go to learn how to do it more technically correctly. But what I did on this, and this is the percent proficient for reading across all the grades and across all the years. So if you think of like 2010, 11, 2011, 12, the percent of students proficient at every grade level, bring them all together, and what would that be for the district in each of those years? And that's what each of those dots represent. The entire district on that particular year, from 11, 12, all the way through this past year, 17, 18. And you see there's not a lot of change in that. The blue line is the trend line or the regression line, the line of best fit. Kind of cuts through all of those in the best form possible. And then up in the corner, there's an equation, an equation for that line. And according to that equation, every year we're averaging a 0.5% proficient increase. Not very much, especially if you think about the No Child Left Behind target, which was in 15 years, 100% would be proficient, which means we'd have to increase our percent proficient by 7, 8, 9, 10% every year over 15 years. But the other part of that equation, if you remember, we talked about the correlation coefficient, how two things relate. And in this case, the correlation coefficient for this and the next few slides is about a 0.7, which is really strong. In the research, sometimes a 0.4, 0.5, 0.6 is significant and meaningful. We've seen them in social sciences in the district between reading, a couple different reading tests by the 0.8 and 9, but 0.7 is fairly strong. And that, an indication of how strong that is, all those dots are really close to the line. And that's what makes it have a high correlation coefficient. If they were a distance apart from the line, a lot way above and a lot way below, that correlation coefficient wouldn't be as strong. But it's a definite increase. The problem is it's just not as much as we'd like it to be. A 0.5% proficient a year is not where we would like to be, but it's not going the other way, and it's definitely not flat. So if we look at the next one, this is another way of measuring, as Dr. Vorthman mentioned, the average national percentile rank. That takes into account all of the students. Percent proficient is only counting the number of students who are above that cut score. So sometimes your low achieving students could make tremendous growth, but they don't add to your percent proficient because they're still not above that cut score. When you look at the average score or the average national percentile rank, that accounts for everybody. Everybody adds to that, so to speak. And so on this one, again, another way of looking at reading scores across all grade levels across all the years, we're looking at about for every year, our students as a whole are increasing their national percentile rank by about 1. So year 1, we're at 60, year 2, we're at 61, year 3, we're at 62. Average national percentile ranking, again, very, very modest, but the correlation coefficient on this would be over 0.7. So again, it's strong and it's a little bit steeper, but again, we're comparing average percentile rank, which is a different measure than percent proficient. So we looked at both of these measures to see how the kids are doing, and if one was going up and one was going down, we'd question that. If both were going down, we'd worry about that. But in this case, both measures show a positive increase over the last 8 years, and that made us feel good. We go to math, and the same thing. We have a line of best fit or a regression line, again, about 0.5% proficient increase every year with an R value or a correlation coefficient just a little under 7% here, or 0.7 here. So again, the math is about reflective of the reading in that we're averaging an additional 0.5% proficient increase each year. If we look at the national percentile rank view, that's a little bit less than the reading in terms of the increase. You can see it's not as steep as that reading line there, where we looked at the national percentile ranks averages, but so it's a little flatter, and it's about 2/3 of an NPR, 2/3 of a national percentile rank score. So the first year the kids might be at 60 as a whole. The next year they'd be at 60.67, not all the way to 61. So it's not as steep, but again, the R value on that would be right at 7. So in all 4 of these analyses, the correlation coefficient was strong at 7 or above, maybe just a little below 7 in that first math slide. And they're all consistent in that they're showing a positive increase over time. So that was the new idea that we had, rather than always talking about which grade levels increased over last year, which grade levels decreased, and in which content area. We're trying to look at all of the last years that we've been administering this assessment and say, so how did they do? And as Dr. Vorthman had mentioned previously, although we know the test doesn't align with what we're teaching with the curriculum, it's very hard to use the test to gauge how well we're doing with regard to teaching and programming and instruction. But one thing we do know is that over time our kids have gotten better, slightly better, in both reading and math.
So before I turn it over to your questions, we wanted to take this growth conversation one step further. In July, we'll be bringing you our first set of data regarding NWA MAP. And so this presentation is really a precursor to that one as we start looking at asking the question, are students making growth over time? Are they setting goals and reaching those goals? And can we see improvement in a test that's administered at 3 distinct points during the year? And that's what we'll be bringing you with the MAP assessment data in July. So at this point, we would welcome any questions that you might have about Iowa assessment results.
Would anyone like to start with a question? Go for it.
I assume the state has all these records or not? Are they doing that same analysis we did?
Not the second part, but the first.
The first part, absolutely.
Yes, I
Yeah,
understand that.
took
We
them
showed
from
that.
them. Yeah, we took them from
So we
the
don't,
reports.
on the second analysis, what do you call it, some kind of meta thing?
Yeah, where we analyzed a number of analysis and the meta-analysis. I haven't seen anything that has come out from the state where they had looked at that. It doesn't mean they haven't done it.
Just be
they
kind of
just
nice to
haven't
know
shared
how
it.
we compare to other school districts, but
Yeah.
we don't have that capability.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So Dr. Shudak has been so diligent in figuring out how to do this work around meta-analysis that he emailed John Hattie, who is the king of meta-analysis, who I've talked about before, and he emailed him back and confirmed that his approach was, and his methodology was sound. So we feel pretty good that we're kind of on the right track with our foray into some advanced statistical analysis.
Questions of the board? So I have some questions, which is not surprising.
No, it's great.
So every time I see this, I always wonder, is average percent proficiency what we expect it should be? Like, do we say, yeah, 40, 50, 60, 70, whatever percent, that is what we would expect in a public school district of kids that are all across the board in nature? Or do we assume, or do we think that does that align well with where we think we should be compared to the other districts and the general body of students in Iowa?
They're all
Just out of
good questions
curious.
that we grapple with all the time. You know, if you look at the data around national percentile rank, if you follow that line of logic, what that would say is any student who is at or around the 50th percentile is right smack dab in the middle. Some kids are, about 50% are above that and 50% are below that. And when you have a norm reference test, that's kind of what you're chasing, is you're chasing that norm group.
And then I
So
would
how far are you
assume-
away from the average?
So then I would assume that districts where you had, I'm gonna say above average kids, but if I chose the kids who were coming into my district for academics, I would expect I would have high scores.
Sure.
In reality, right?
More of your kids would probably be above the
Should be
50th
above average.
percentile than are below.
You bet. Okay, so seems reasonable. The proficiency for grade 11 in both math and reading fell by like 15% from the prior year by cohort. What do we think happened there?
Mrs. Smith and I just had this conversation this morning with one of our high school principals. And that principal relayed some anecdotal information. I don't know how representative it is of the whole, but there's not a lot of incentive for 11th graders to take the Iowa assessments exceptionally seriously. They're oftentimes much more worried about ACT scores and AP tests. Not saying that as an excuse, but maybe a reality. And so what we were brainstorming this afternoon was what incentives would be most appropriate for students in the 11th grade to help them understand that it's an important measurement that is an indicator of how well our school district is doing, to encourage them to take it seriously. We do know that there are some flaws with the 11th grade. It's either the 10th grade or the 11th grade. One of them is off, that's giving this spike statewide. And we've challenged the State Department on it, and they've been somewhat quiet about it. They acknowledge that it is an anomaly, but they don't have an explanation. The math, I don't believe, is that case.
So what are those incentives? I can't think of an incentive that would make sense to me
We
as a
thought
high
of three
school
this
junior.
morning that I think are pretty good.
But, well, I just, when you're a high school junior and
Yeah.
we're taking another assessment
Correct.
next week, and it's not the ACT, and I'm thinking about going to college or whatever it is, yeah. I'm gonna take the ACT for the 5th time.
Yeah, I mean, we've batted around lots of ideas. None of these have we ran up the flagpole or thought are one's good or bad or otherwise, but some ideas that have been thrown out, like if a student takes the IO assessment and scores proficient, then they're exempted from finals. And then they would not have to come back to school on the last 2 days of the try for finals. Another one would be if a student tested on IO assessments and they were proficient, then they would be eligible for short day. But students who were not proficient would not be eligible for short day. I don't know if any of those have traction with students. There are a couple of ideas that we brainstormed this morning, may or may not be relevant. But you're right, it's hard to find what incentive is going to work for the most kids.
Well, is the IO assessment, are they useful to you? I'm just, it's kind of
think when
hard,
we look
it's
at
hard
it
to,
through
kind of
this
hard to
lens-
incentivize juniors who, they don't see a very good reason to take it unless you dangle a carrot.
Right.
And they aren't that useful to the district or to teachers, so.
They're summative measures, so therefore, by their very purpose, they have to be used for what they were intended. And unfortunately, No Child Left Behind and AYP did not do us any favors in this march toward accountability using this type of measure. And so when we look at it through the lens of growth, yeah, I think it is good for a school system to have some objective measures that say, how do we do compared to others? I think that's important. But in terms of usefulness for guiding instruction or looking at program evaluation or curriculum changes, no, they're not that useful because it's not aligned. If it were aligned, then I think we'd have a better case to say, yeah, this is relevant data that we can't wait to get our hands on. When the MAP data came back, we were hungering to get that data back to see, okay, how are kids doing where we know that there's a direct correlation back to the core standards? And there are areas where we were surprised, both in a good way and a not so good way. So I think in that case, the assessment creates a sense of urgency around, okay, we've got to do something. We have to respond to it. When you have an assessment that is, everyone knows is not aligned, it makes it hard for people to take it seriously.
So we get student information by student or no?
Yes.
So can we see, do we look at like cohorts within cohorts, kids who have struggled for X number of years, and is the additional interventions and things causing change with that particular cohort, or our top kids? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how to use that. Like, I look at this like, okay.
We don't use the IO
Not
assessment
at
for that.
all.
We
Okay.
use
We
our
may
own
use the
formative
FAST test, we will use the MAP test for that. We have individual district assessments that we use for that, but the IO assessment has not proven to be an indicator that we can rely on, unfortunately.
So let me kind of chime in here. That was a reason, when I learned that the Iowa assessment wasn't aligned, that we need a district assessment. The other piece, the good part is I can see the nose up on most of this growth data versus nose down. But getting it one time a year, at one moment in time, on an assessment that's E or F, and most of it's F,
F now,
and we're behind other states that's doing all of this online, and our kids are still bubbling. The MAP assessment that we're going to be able to do, we'll be able to really look at the pivotal moments in time so that we know if we need to pivot or not pivot, is our interventions working or not working? Because we will come before the board 3 times next year to show you the baseline to the first assessment, to the winter, and to the spring. And you all will be able to see student growth or no growth, and we can look at that now by grade levels, by building, by classroom, by student, and our parents will have access. And this assessment will be aligned to our core standards, plus it will already really almost distribute our children so that our teachers know where they are on that continuum of learning. And so that is powerful. With this, we're just hoping that some way we align. I mean, we could teach to the test, but that's not educating children. We could have, put away, and the state moved to the Common Core standards, which they called, something else, Iowa Core, and tweaked it some. And so I applaud that we went forward with teaching and not preparing students just to take this assessment. Because you could easily do that and increase your proficiency rates. Do I think we have some ways to come? Yes. Am I happy with what I saw in the proficiency rates? Not at all. But I need a tool that gives me touch points throughout the year, so I know how we're doing. We can adjust. I can't change, play calls at the end of the year on one assessment, but we can next year with what we have with the map. And that is a great place for our district to be. We're finally in a place where we will take control of this and be able to really pinpoint students that are struggling and not making the growth beyond formative assessments and beyond just our end of the unit assessments.
And we really want to turn the conversation to growth.
Yes.
NCLB kind of put us in this trap where it was all about this magical proficiency, which means a lot of different things to a lot of different people and can be easily be manipulated. I mean, basically, it's a way of saying, are you chasing the average? And what we want to do is say, okay, kid, you're starting here, and you want to be here. So let's see, after 3 months of instruction, how much you grow. And after 3 more months of instruction, how much you grow. So when we come back to you, don't be surprised that you won't hear us talking a lot about proficiency. We'll be talking a lot about what percentage of our kids are making adequate growth. That's where we're really going to start emphasizing those conversations, goal-setting conversations with kids and with teachers and with principals about making sure that our kids are making enough improvement year to year to year.
In fact, NWA does not provide proficiencies. It is all about growth and how our students are going according to the national norm.
Yeah, I did find something interesting in this, that in all this time when we were, I think, focusing more and more on reading and literacy, literacy still remains somewhat the same. And I think, at least parents' perceptions, is that we've pulled back from science in areas to do more reading and that. In our science scores have pretty much stayed consistent, and they're typically higher nationally and statewide for whatever reason. I don't quite know why that is, that we just do well in science, don't do as well as we think we should in reading, but even with a little less focus on it, we still do well in science.
Science test is much more about content. Do you know the black and white content, and can you read and interpret charts and graphs? That's basically how the Iowa assessment looks at science. Math is much more about concepts, as is reading much more about comprehension, and can you apply comprehension strategies. So they look at learning in a little bit of a different way, the same way when we used to take the social studies. Our kids scored off the charts in social studies. But they're different. It's kind of a different animal.
So now that we are testing differently or assessing differently, do we see that we will be changing some of our focus on some of these things? I think, we pushed so hard at reading for a while or literacy for a while, and it was for some classes, our grade level was like 3 hours of the day, or 3 kind of periods, I thought, time-wise. I mean, is this going to drive us to change
I don't think so.
how we do things the rest of the time?
We just finished a revision of science curriculum, so it mirrors the state standards. We will be getting ready for a overhaul of social studies in the next 2 and 3 years as the state adopted the new social studies standards. And we're in the midst right now of math. That's not driven by the Iowa assessment. That's driven by what do we know is good for kids? What feedback do we hear from teachers? What data internally do we have that says kids are making progress or they're not making progress? We know that this data is one data point, but there are many others that say that we can do better in math. And we've got some things to shift around and some resources to realign. So that's why we took on that project this year, after we had spent the previous 2 years really going after reading in a different way.
Any questions?
Well, I'm just trying to figure out how we can use this information that we've had for these last 7 years and be able to overlay what all of the different assessments that we take. are we seeing a similar, I mean, what data is telling us that what we're doing in the classroom is having the best effect on student achievement? And I mean, if we've got 4 or 5 different assessments that we're taking, one that's not aligned to the curriculum that we're presenting in the classroom, it doesn't make sense that is the standard that we're shooting for. But that's what the state says we have to do. How are we using the other data that we collect, the other types of assessments, to make those changes in the classroom that give us the growth? I mean,
I think the map assessment
how can we
will-
overlay all of these
Sure.
different assessments and find the one or two that are giving us the best information on what the teachers are doing, teachers and paras, and all of the people that are disseminating that information to the students? I mean, it just has to be frustrating to have to do one thing, but we know that the other data that we're collecting is actually the driving force for what we should be doing in the classroom. How can we make that change?
Our hope is that the map assessment gives us a data point that is richly aligned to what teachers are seeing on their curriculum maps and what they already know they should be teaching. And the nice thing about the reports that the map provides is gives the actual standard that kids should be hitting, and they can go right back to their curriculum maps and say, yeah, I taught that, or gosh, no, I didn't teach that, or that's not until next unit, or that's in unit 3. Some of the other assessments that we use are for totally different purposes. And so I think that's the hardest thing to remember is in all of our professions, we use different tools to do different things. Mark and Julie brought you some information last month about FAST. That's an assessment that we use, but it's really to cast a broad net to see who needs additional support. It's not going to tell us is our curriculum working very well. It's not going to tell us is the instruction in the classroom meeting the needs of every student. It's going to say, hey, this kid needs some additional support. Go help them. Go figure out what the problem is. We have diagnostic instruments that are very specific to a very small subset of skills that we use. Once we've identified that kid needs additional help, then we use that assessment to say, okay, what specifically are the 4 things that the student is struggling with? That's another type of assessment. Then you have these big global assessments like ACT and Iowa assessments that are supposed to tell us, is our system moving? Is our system getting better? But unfortunately, in our practice, we misuse assessments. We do. And some of that is our own internal doing. Some is state and federal governments telling us to misuse them. I don't know any good researcher who would tell you that you should use a norm reference measure for accountability.
Because you're
But we
constantly.
did.
Yeah. I
We
mean,
did it for 15 years.
So that was a great little monologue there that should be on what assessments we use and how we try to help your children.
Yeah.
On the website.
Diane has created some great guides. If you, on the assessment, under the teaching and learning department, if you click on assessment, you'll see by grade level, some guides that show all the assessments that we give and for what purpose we give them and what we use the data for. I think they're great kind of that primer into what is all this educational testing about and why do we do so much?
Yeah, I have one more. In looking through the data school by school,
Yeah.
big variance.
Yeah.
And I assume you administrators look at that and say, what's going on? And you try to figure out how to help that school? And it's interesting how, over the years, some schools vary and others are pretty constant. It's just kind of like finding a needle in the haystack almost. But I assume you make an attempt at that. Good.
And I think, Bill, to the other piece that we've really talked about is, again, I always feel like it's hard to hold one test at the end of the year and the supports throughout the year. What I used to say until I had district assessments was I was throwing darts, trying to pinpoint where we could make some changes. I needed an instrument that gave me those touch points 3 times a year, because a principal can be doing some really good things, but it's not the right really good things. And I needed something to provide that guideline or that roadmap so that they could look at each one of the students. They could also look at the classrooms and compare where teachers are making differences so that they could bring collaboration together. And until I can give them that assessment next year, I felt like this year, I was watching again, as I've stated before, I couldn't put my finger, I didn't have a real read on the pulse like we will next year. And it's, when we are able to bring up the data and you all are able to see how far we can drill down, for principals to be able to have that conversation with classroom teachers around what's occurring, it's making decision in real time versus at the end trying to analyze and go back, what happened.
I do think you can look at like the Iowa Assessments reading part, and you see that middle school, 5, 6 years back, it was not focus of us, and the scores were,
Yeah.
right? And then a lot of changes have taken place,
And you
and
see
that,
it.
and their scores have jumped up. You know, it's like, I mean, to move it 10% or so over time is pretty substantial. You know, so certainly you can look back and see
Yeah.
bigger things, but.
And I also, riding the Rollercoaster Ride is very alarming and concerning as you look at building by building. And I think this will be a way that we can support those buildings. Because yes, we saw some, I say nose up. I always want my nose up, but I don't want my nose going down. I don't want to crash. But there's some variance that we need to really kind of,
Figure out what's
yep,
going on.
yep.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Awesome. Okay, now we,
Come to our informational.
informational presentations. Yeah.
Great. At this time, Mr. Wilson is going to join us. He is going to present on our 2018-19 Employee Handbook. This was sent to the board members about 2 weeks ago, I think, and hopefully you had time to review. He's going to hit some highlights for us and really cover some areas that are changes, and then answer any questions that you might have. So, Mr. Wilson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Murillo. Good evening. Okay, so the purpose of the employee handbook, there was a lot of discussion, I know, in the past several months about the employee handbook versus other documents, but the purpose of the employee handbook is a way that we can compile policies and procedures and working conditions, behavioral expectations that guide the employee's actions. We want to also emphasize the rights of the employer and the employee in the employee handbook, and we want to create as much uniformity among all our different groups as much as possible. So that is our goal in creating the employee handbook. The district handbook was carefully developed. I can definitely assure you of that. We vetted a lot of the wording and prepared the handbook with various groups, which I'll get to in a minute. We understood the concern among various employee groups of what was stated in the handbook and reviewed it not only for accuracy, but in terms of equity among all those employee groups. So the district staff reviewed our current employee procedures guide, and we also went and looked and pulled online a number of other employee handbooks from other districts around the state. We then kind of took what we felt was the best of all of that, and then also transferred certain aspects of the various union contracts into the handbook. District administrators vetted this a number of times, and Dr. Murillo and her superintendent's roundtable, which was comprised of certified and classified staff, represented by all the unions that we have, reviewed the handbook twice and provided her feedback regarding what they needed, what they liked, or where they needed more clarification. Drafts had been presented to the board, as Dr. Murillo said, and we did an additional review by an outside editor in terms of grammar and wording, because we wanted, as I said earlier, we wanted to make sure that we got this thing right. So, what I wanted to highlight tonight was the migrated language that we had moved over from the union contracts over to the handbook. So the collective bargaining rights, which are on page 13, states the district recognizes the rights of employees to unionize and mentions the specific unions in there as well. The compensation schedules on page 14, although they refer you to the STAR website to look at some of the actual schedules, is exactly the same as it was in the contracts. Certification credits on page 14 and 15 are exactly the same as they were in the contracts. The overtime provisions is the same language, and it meets the federal guidelines. The payroll dates are the same on page 16, and the benefits on page 19 and 20 are the same in the current contracts. We did not change the benefits. We changed the health insurance one, but you know that we enhanced that. But we did not take away anything from the employees. We also did some enhancements and some modifications from the contract. On leave on page 22 and to 28, we liberalized the earnings of vacation. Qualified CWA members had 30 years, and SEIU members had 25 years to earn 22 days of paid time off. We replaced that threshold with 20-plus years. So we added that for the employees. The emergency leave, as we've discussed before, was replaced by the bereavement leave, and the district is also allowing staff to use 10 of their 15 annual sick days in order to use for family care. So if a spouse or a person who's in their care, a child obviously, they could use those days. Holiday pay, which is on page 15 and 16, remained exactly the same as well among all the groups. There was some concern about the grievance procedures. We added a complaint and concern procedure on page 36 and 37. The process and the language, as was listed on the agreements, is exactly the same. If you look at all three of the contracts, in fact, we made it a little bit better. Some had better wording than others. We made it basically the same. The only thing that was different is that at the end of the contracts, there was an arbitration clause where now it's the superintendent would review it, and his or her word would be final on that. We also added language that a person must work 60 work days in order to be eligible for vacation. That would prevent somebody who would be here 3 weeks. They'd get 10 days a year. They quit, then we have to pay them off for all 10. So in order to protect the district, we said you had to be here 60 days to be eligible for your insurance. One of the things I did want to point out is that we're going to ask the board to approve this employee handbook every year, even if no language changes are made, just to ensure that the board does review it every year, to give some employee groups the peace of mind to know that the board is looking out over management to determine if anything should be changed. So with that, I'll open it up for discussion.
All right. Any questions from the board?
So first question, I guess just because there's the three different unions, CBEA has not had their contract renewed yet. Would they use this handbook, or would they use a separate employee handbook?
So the CBA provisions that apply to their contract, those remain in force. The other employees groups would be under this, including the exempt, the administrators as well. There are some provisions of CBA that were changed to mirror what's in the handbook, which the CBA approved.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
I just had one, Dean.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So under the benefits, the medical, dental, and vision, those are available to all employees, full-time employees?
The dental currently is not. The CWA group is not under the dental. However, Dr. Murillo and I are working with Silverstone to develop a cost-efficient way that we can introduce this benefit in the future.
Okay.
Sir?
Point of clarification. Now, next year, the compensation schedule for teachers will have to be dealt with. Because for purposes of this handbook being in effect this year, you're going by the old contract for the teachers. So that's maybe another reason why it's good to have the contract or the handbook coming to the board every year. I like that.
I agree.
I just had a question about the complaint procedure. Am I correct in understanding that board policy dictates at least some of the things that are covered in the handbook? And maybe not, the policy doesn't necessarily spell out the entire procedure for employees. That's what the purpose of the handbook is.
Yes.
I have been reviewing the board policy on complaint procedure with the handbook. You might want to, I don't know if you reviewed the board policy when compiling the handbook language, but there might be some differences there
Okay, we'll look at that.
in those two things.
As I said, we took that exactly from where what the contracts say now. And we did try to take into account what board policy was, but we'll definitely look at that again.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions from the board? I want to say, I just think it's a great,
I think
Effort and
overall,
job
it's a
by
very
everybody.
good job putting it together. It looks good. What's the acronym EAP stand for again?
license program.
I thought that was very well done and generous in there. I didn't realize, was that a part of all our contracts?
It was.
Should have
We
been.
always offer employees.
It's actually not, well, it's part of, it's an add-on to our health insurance. So if people are having issues, they can call the EAP program and such.
I guess I was not aware. I should have been all the years on the board. That was in there. But when I read it, I thought, boy, that's good. I hope our employees understand that. Now, that brings up another question. I'm just going to give everybody a copy and say, read it. Are you going to spend some time somewhere saying, hitting the highlights like you did with us, or what?
Yes, we are going to give every employee a copy of this, and any new hire will receive a copy of it as well. We'll also have an electronic version. In the back of the handbook, on the last page, we will be collecting signatures from people saying, I've read and understand the handbook. So in case someone comes back and says, well, you never told me that, we're giving you the opportunity to read the handbook.
So then there are some broad kind of things on here, and are there spots where, like you'd mentioned about the complaints and board policy, are there spots where there's, I assume that's been vetted all across that board policies?
We thought we had.
We did try to do
Okay.
that, yes. And also what we, except in a few cases, we did not want to repeat the policies in here because the document would get quite large.
Yeah.
We did it a couple of times because we thought the policy was actually clarifying points that the employee had to know. But we do refer them back to the policy, and we also did try to vet it against the policy to make sure we were not in conflict.
Okay.
But it was really important when I met with the union leaders that that complaint process and was in there, and it was resembled what they had in their contract. So we tried, as we worked through that piece with them, this is really close to what they're used to seeing, and that was really important to them, that we had that in there.
Yeah, and to be clear, I didn't go through line by line
Okay.
and pull out where there were distinct differences. They read very differently to me. I just want to make sure that there is a review to make sure that there
Well-
isn't some sort of hole or gap somewhere, that, you know, there should be alignment between the policy and the
Exactly.
handbook, so.
Correct.
We'll make sure.
Yeah, so I guess then my question would just be, does it say in here to look back at board policy at all?
It does have places and has links,
Okay.
so they'll be able to click on that online and go right to it.
I mean, I see like policy 418, some other things, but, okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you.
done a great job because they aren't here.
And we did, it was important to me to get the feedback. We twice at the superintendent's roundtable, and I asked them to share with the staff in the building, because I have someone almost from every building on the roundtable. And then I had all of the union leaders, we sit down and read through it together and talked page by page almost. So we did spend some time with them and then asked for feedback outside of it.
Thank you. And now we come to the resolution portion of the meeting. The first up is for policy review and approval and second reading of policies. Is there a motion?
I'll move to approve the following policies and administrative regulations as presented. 222, public hearings. 407, use of electronic surveillance and security equipment staff. 408, communicable diseases employees. 408.1, universal precaution regulations. 408.2, diseases reportable to Iowa Department of Public Health chart. 420, resignation of licensed personnel. 424, Family and Medical Leave Act. And 426, paraeducators.
Thank you, Chris. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, David. Any discussion or questions on the second reading of the policies? Okay. Kyle? Okay. Mr. Wilson, please call the roll.
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
Yes,
Mr. Arthur.
Yes, and the second reading of the policies is approved. Now we come to the 2018-2019 Employee Handbook. Is there a motion?
I move that we approve the 2018-2019 Employee Handbook as presented.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
second.
Any discussion on the handbook we just discussed? All right, Mr. Wilson?
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
Yes,
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
Mr. Arthur.
Yes, and the employee handbook is approved. Now we have a special education consortium agreement. Is there a motion?
I will move approval of the 2018-19 Special Education 28E Consortium Agreement.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. McGlade. Is there any discussion on this kind of continuing agreement we have? All right, seeing none, Mr. Wilson?
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
yes,
Mr. Arthur.
Yes, and the agreement is approved. Now we have approval of standing committee's annual report. Is there a motion?
I'll move to approve the Standing Committee's annual report as presented.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
second.
Thank you, Mr. Grove. Any discussion on this report? I guess I had a question on one. On the Finance Committee report, Finance Committee, we have Ms. Riley listed as board affiliation.
I'm sorry, say that
We
again?
have Susan Riley listed as board affiliation on this.
Yeah, she used to be the board affiliate, but that's an error.
Okay. Okay.
I am now, huh?
You are.
I think I'm the board rep on that finance committee now, because I met with him once.
It may have been that, and I don't remember right offhand, but she may have met before her term ended
Okay.
last September, but I don't know that for sure.
You might be
Yeah.
right, yeah. But should we, I mean, it doesn't matter.
The next
Should we correct
report
this?
will
The next one
show the
report?
correction.
Next year at this time, my name will be there.
Right.
It'd be nice.
We'll show the
Feel
new-
really
new
important.
standing members.
All right. All right, any other discussion on these? Okay, Mr. Wilson?
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
Yes,
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
and Mr. Arthur.
Yes, and the annual report is approved. Now we have approval agreement with West Central Community Action for Head Start for 18-19 school year. Is there a motion?
Move that we approve the agreement with West Central Community Action for Head Start programs for the 2018-2019 school year.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. John, any discussion on this? Any questions? We've all been thoroughly prepared and come to the meeting ready to go. All right, Mr. Wilson?
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
Yes.
and Mr. Arthur.
Yay. Thank you, sir. And the agreement is approved. Now we have approval of a MOU with Iowa Western Community College. Is there a motion?
I'll move to approve the MOU with Iowa Western Community College for concurrent enrollment for the 2018-19 school year.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on this? Nope. Mr. Wilson?
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
Yes.
Mr. Arthur.
Yes, and the memorandum of understanding with Iowa Western is approved. Now we have denial of late file open enrollment out applications. There's 4 there. Is there a motion?
I move that the board approve the denials for open enrollment out applications due to late filings for students A, B, C, and D as presented.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Bill. Any discussion on these?
Is there any more information that can be provided other than what was in the report?
Yeah.
I've asked Mr. Hamilton to join me at this part because he reviews all the applications and
Dean,
speaks with the
Can you
parents.
pull down the vote?
Yeah, so Mr.
Yes.
Hamilton?
So the hard part with these open enrollment applications is if they file after March 1st, there's really 2 reasons why we can approve them. One is for harassment that has occurred after March 1st, and then the other one is for medical reasons. So when we work with the families, when we call them, because we call them before we move forward with bringing them to the board and let them know that because of these reasons they're denied, we give them an opportunity to present anything else that they can, and we've had a few in the past who will bring medical documentation or something to us. The 4 that are in front of you, you have the information that they gave us, along with some of them, you can see some of the extra writings. That's what we have received, so there really is no extra information to present to you on each
Okay.
student. I mean, if you had specific questions over the students, I could certainly answer them for you, because we do look at each student when they come in.
Well, the part of the reason why I ask is the last time we denied one of these, it came back and then we reversed our decision. So I understand every family's in a different situation, and maybe they're totally fine with the initial denial from the district and there's nothing else to really know on our side of things, but.
You may remember, I believe with that one, that was an open enrollment into us.
Oh,
So
that's
the
right. That's right.
district
Yeah.
The district that they were in had approved them because, and
Right.
I can't remember if
They
it was
approved them
for
out.
Yeah,
harassment
you're
or
right, yeah.
for medical reasons. So we were denying at that time based upon space, but then we came back and looked at some of their options for programming for that student.
Yeah.
I think sometimes
right.
you have
Sorry
folks
about
who,
that.
you have folks who move into district
Yeah.
after the cutoff, which
Right.
would be difficult, you know.
Yeah.
Do you tell the parents that they have an opportunity to make a presentation to us when you recommend that, to us, that they're going to be denied?
Yep, we have had a few parents who have asked, what are the next steps? How do I appeal this? And then we tell them that they can certainly come to a board meeting, because it's ultimately your ability to approve or deny.
So they know that.
Correct.
There's nobody here.
Daniel is here.
Maybe he has an open enrollment request, huh?
I would say in full, I had someone who approached me about one of these that I know, so I'll be not voting, but, yeah. Any other questions on this? All right, Mr. Wilson?
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
Yes.
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
and Mr. Arthur.
I'll abstain. And the open enrollment out application denial is approved. Now we have approval agreement with School Administrators of Iowa for their School Administrative Manager Program. Is there a motion?
I will move to approve the agreement with School Administrators of Iowa for implementation of the School Administrative Manager Program for the 2018-19 school year.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Mr. Wilson, please call the roll.
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
Yes.
Mr. Arthur.
Yes, and the agreement with the SAM program is approved. Now we approve a new job description for substitute assistant custodians. Is there a motion?
I move that we approve the new job description for the substitute assistant custodians as presented.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Chris. Any discussion on this new position? I'm guessing this is filling a pressing need.
What was that? I'm sorry.
Filling a need we have.
Yeah.
And want to make sure that we can, I guess, fill positions with substitutes versus only asking people that are here to work. Because some of our custodians, sometimes it's a lot of overtime until we find people. And so there are some substitutes that we'd like to get in place to not create such hardships on our other employees. So this substitute position will allow us to do that.
Okay. Any questions on this program? Mr. Wilson?
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
Yes.
and Mr. Arthur.
Yes, and the job description is approved. Now we have approval of the demolition package presented earlier. Is there a motion?
Move to approve Anderson Construction Company of Council Bluffs, Iowa, in the amount of $320,170 for demolition work in the CTE classrooms at Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson High Schools.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on this demo package? All right, Mr. Wilson.
Mr. Minshaw,
Yes.
Mr. Kazire,
Yes.
Mr. McGlade,
Yes.
Mr. LaFurla,
Yes.
Mr. Grove,
Yes.
Mr. Arthur.
Yes, and the demolition package is approved, and we can get started. Now we have our consent agenda. That includes student fees, public record fees, MOU between Underwood Community School District and us, MOU with Clear Minds Therapy, Family Connections, Full Circle Therapy, Heartland Family Services, and Transitional Services of Iowa for next year. Personnel agenda, purchasing card transactions, financial results, and checks and ACH payments. It's a lot. Is there a motion?
I move approval of our consent agenda.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion?
I just have a question. With these 5 or 6 mental health providers, does the parent get to choose where to go, or we recommend, or how do we do that?
Yeah, Mr. Hamilton?
Usually in
Tim?
their IEP.
My question is, how do we decide which one of these mental health providers do we suggest to the families or whatever?
Typically, up until the new position that you guys approved for next year, the providers were based upon We had certain providers in each school, and then those providers had therapists that we use. Because we have the new clinical director of student family services, and that's one of her roles, we're really taking on all of the providers, but then the therapist, we're getting bios on each of them, so we know the kids and what the kids' needs are, and we know where their area of expertise is. So we'll make recommendations from just the bios and the strengths of the therapists moving forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just curious, because you got quite a few to choose from.
Yeah, there's actually one more that we use, but the way the MOU is written, we don't have to approve every year, because if there's no changes to it, we don't have to approve. So we also have CHI as well that provides their services.
How do we evaluate those relationships? Is that just a parent, us, teacher, student conversation, or how's that?
Yeah, the evaluation now is really, can they meet our needs? So we've had some in the past where we've made referrals and they were never able to accept them, or they waited. And so can they meet the immediate need of the student? So provide those therapy services right away. And then just from conversations with the parent and with the student, with our staff at schools.
But I think moving forward, since we have the new position, we do need to create an evaluation process to see if they're meeting the needs of our students.
Correct.
And if it's someone we want to keep referring to.
Yep.
Well, this is one of our goals as a board. We've stressed that we want to improve mental health services, so I'm encouraged to see that the number of providers are willing to help us.
Yeah. When I go to MOAC and I talk to other school districts, and this is obviously not just a struggle in Council Bluffs, this is a struggle nationwide. We are very fortunate in this community that we have people who are willing to step up and willing to help, especially the number that we have here, so.
And I would also kind of piggyback on that you're stating, Mr. Gross, because one of our post-100-day plan goals was mental health. And Tim's team took on that challenge. First, we looked internally to see what we could do, and we knew we had to provide more services from outside. So it became really, the goal was to create more partnerships. And then, if you remember at one time, we presented you with that chart where each person in a school can look to see kind of next steps and what that looks like. And that has been some really good work this year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the, or discussion on the consent agenda? All right, Mr. Wilson?
Mr. Kazire?
Yes.
Mr. LaFurla?
Yes.
Mr. Minshaw?
Yes.
Mr. McGlade?
Yes.
Mr. Grove?
Yes.
Mr. Arthur?
Yes, and the consent agenda is approved. Okay. Dave's got his board workshop development. Did everyone have a chance to look through that video online on that we talked about last time? Seeing how we don't have Jill. And we don't have Jill here, and we also don't have our board policies right there anymore. Maybe we'll just get that. And I kind of, we talked a little bit about having maybe a, more of just a special meeting with the board to start that program. If that would be something people would be interested in. We have a lot of time in July with these big open months. If that would work better.
I would sure encourage us to do it, because we've got two board members,
Yep.
two new board members, that I think would be helpful to them and wouldn't hurt for the rest of us to have a discussion about all that again.
Yeah, you know, the first chapter in there is on the focusing direction, or the second chapter on it, is kind of taking through your guiding principles as a board, seeing what you align on, seeing what you think are the most prominent focus areas that you should be working on as a board team, and then trying to agree on that purpose, and then trying to align board policy, district policy, and action with those items. And that might best be done in a more of a learning session. I talked to Harry about coming over and doing something with us as kind of a board role and governance type of a meeting, which he is open to doing come more into the fall. I don't know, Dave, any thoughts on that?
Well, I like, on chapter 2, I mean, it seems like whenever we're setting our superintendent goals, it seems like they always are more than what feel comfortable. And
Yeah, too many.
it seems like there are just too many goals that we're setting. And chapter 2 talks about limiting those goals so that you can have a chance to focus on those so that you're not constantly changing. I mean, so I mean, it would be helpful for us as a body to be able to have those conversations that have that moral imperative on what is most important for student learning. I mean, what do we want our superintendent to focus on? And if we've got 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 goals that we're expecting our superintendent to reach, that may be a little overload. And I guess it's up to us to be able to have the conversations to decide what's most important to us as a board, and then relay that to our superintendent in the goal-setting process.
I agree. You know, I keep thinking back to, I always think back to our strategic planning sessions, you know, and that plan that came out of there, and I think, man, that sure was a lot of stuff. And I'm looking at Corey, I'm thinking he probably worked pretty hard on all that stuff, and I'm sure it was all necessary. But are there things in there that we did that took us off of other areas? I don't know if you want to hop up and just talk. I'd love to see your thoughts on some of that if you want to. You know, but some of that clarity of strategy part, you know, so we're going to have a, you know, feedback session here, and, you know, we always seem to have 5 or 6 key things to work on and a whole lot of other key things that could pop up throughout the year that might be taking us away. I do love the fact that with this direction we've gone with this map, you know, trying to assess our students finally in a way that we hope will drive instruction. I think that's probably was one of always our big goals that, you know, maybe was more of a guiding thing. And I don't know, without, you know, as a board, you really don't do a whole lot more than approve things and give the superintendent direction. You know, so is that something we would want to limit ourselves to a few key things when there's so much to do? Bill, you were soup for a long time. What's your thoughts on that?
It always sounds good, but when a crisis arises, you got to take care of that too. And sometimes, you know, you have to put the goals that the board has set aside to take care of a major crisis. Fortunately, you don't have too many of those, hopefully, but I think it's good for the board to say, here's 2 or 3 things we really want you to pay attention to. I mean, I think personally, one of the reasons we hired Dr. Murillo because of her background with improving student achievement. We identified that as our biggest goal. And, you know, we had proof again tonight that we're making progress, but not as much as we'd like. And to me, that's got to stay there. And whatever comes after that, I have a couple more, that's good.
You know, I see in private industry where we'll set up our same kind of things. We get one main focus, and then pretty soon there's 2 or 3 other focuses, and then there's 8 or 10 other things, and we forget about that one that makes sense to everybody else. If we focus only on that, we would make a difference.
Hey, we got a good example right now. She's going to have to do a lot of work on this potential bond issue. right? And that's not one of her original goals.
Right.
So I think as a board, we have to understand that there's some flexibility here.
Agree. Agree. Okay. Any thoughts from Kyle or John or Chris on setting direction of the district? Just curious.
I'm in agreement on narrowing the focus. I think there's a lot of benefits to that. I think it would be, to go back to your initial question, I think it would be beneficial I would be open to scheduling a separate meeting for the board, specifically for board development, where we really can, kind of get together maybe around a table instead of out here with microphones and really, spend some time talking about how we want to grow and improve as a board.
Okay.
I would be open to doing that. The summer, summer's busy. It's hard to do that, but I would make time for that.
All right. All right. So, we now need a resolution to go into closed session. Who would like to make that?
Be it resolved that the board go into closed session as provided in section 21.5, parent 1, parent I of the Open Meetings Law be conducted to evaluate the professional competency of an individual whose performance is being considered to prevent needless and irreparable injury to that individual's reputation, and that the individual has requested a closed session.
Thank you, sir. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on this? Mr. Wilson, please call the roll.
Mr. Kazire.
Yes.
Mr. LaFurla.
Yes.
Mr. Minshaw.
Yes.
Mr. McGlade.
Yes.
Mr. Grove.
Yes.
Mr. Arthur.
Yes, and we are in closed session.
But I did print copies, so if you guys wanted to reference anything. So it's either way. I printed a copy because I knew that. But if you want to click on something, you can take it.
I didn't put it there.